The twin moons of Varela 9 hung low in the evening sky as Jace Torrin made his way back from the salvage yards. His hands were rough from work and his clothes were coated in a fine layer of metallic dust that clung stubbornly to the fabric. The air smelled faintly of burned wiring and cold iron, a scent that never seemed to leave the mining colony. It was another long day, and his legs felt like they carried the weight of the whole settlement. The path to his shelter wound through narrow corridors between rows of old prefab buildings. The wind that swept down from the barren hills carried a sharp chill. Small lights strung between homes flickered under the gusts, and the sound of distant machinery hummed like a tired heartbeat. People here were used to hardship. They had to be. The colony was far from the core worlds and even farther from the comforts of plenty. Supplies came on cargo ships only once every few weeks, when they came at all. This time, they had not come. For almost a month, the people of Varela 9 had been living on whatever they could scrape together. The pirates who roamed the outer rim had taken control of the shipping lanes, demanding payments the colony could never afford. The blockade had tightened, and the shelves in the small supply stores were empty. Jace had spent his shifts salvaging what he could from the husks of abandoned freighters on the edge of the scrapyard. He traded spare parts for ration coupons, but lately even that was no longer enough. As he turned the last corner, he saw the glow from the single lamp outside his shelter. It was a small, boxy structure with walls patched in places where storms had torn at the panels. The door groaned slightly when he pushed it open, letting out a faint sigh of warm air from inside. He stepped in and closed the door quickly to keep the cold out. Two small figures sat on the thin couch near the heating unit. His children, Kyle and Mina, looked up at him the moment they heard his boots scrape the floor. Kyle was 10, his hair, dark like his father's but messier, as if combing it had become less important than saving energy. Mina was 7, with bright eyes that seemed too big for her small face. Both of them looked thinner than they had just a month ago. Their cheeks had lost their fullness, and the spark in their eyes had been dimmed by days of hunger. Jace forced a smile as he reached into his work bag. He pulled out a wrapped bundle and set it on the small table in front of them. It was a sandwich, carefully saved from the small portion he had been given during his midday break. 2 slices of coarse bread, a thin layer of vegetable paste, and a few precious slivers of preserved meat. It was nothing compared to the meals they once had, but here and now it was worth more than Gold Mina's eyes widened at the sight of it. Kale swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the bundle. Jace sat down with them, unwrapping the sandwich slowly, as if the simple act deserved reverence. The smell was faint but warm, and for a moment it filled the room with a sense of comfort they had not felt in weeks. He broke the sandwich into 3 uneven pieces. Without a word, he slid the larger 2 portions toward Kyle and Mina, keeping the smallest piece for himself. Mina looked at her father's portion and frowned. "You need more than that," she said quietly. "I already ate," Jace lied with a gentle smile, though they both knew it was not true. He placed the small piece on his lap and gestured for them to eat. Kyle hesitated for only a moment before taking a bite, chewing slowly as if trying to make the food last as long as possible. Mina took small bites too, her eyes never leaving her father's face. Jace watched them eat, the tension in his chest easing just a little. Seeing them fed, even for one meal, felt like a small victory. Outside, the wind howled against the metal walls. Somewhere in the distance, a warning siren wailed, for a few seconds before falling silent again. The colony was a place of constant unease. Even when there was no immediate danger, the weight of uncertainty pressed on everyone. Yet here, in this small room, Jace focused only on the sound of his children chewing quietly. The warmth of the heating unit on his back and the steady rhythm of their breathing. When the last crumbs were gone, Mina leaned against his shoulder, her small body warm despite the thin fabric of her shirt. Kyle wiped his mouth and looked at his father, his expression thoughtful. There was something in his gaze that Jace could not quite name, something between admiration and gratitude. For a brief moment, the hunger, the cold, and the fear seemed far away. Jace knew that tomorrow would bring another long shift at the salvage yard, another day of struggling to find enough to feed them. But for now, he let himself breathe. For now, he could pretend that things would get better. The heater hummed softly in the corner, casting a small circle of warmth across the room. Outside, the wind's steady whistle seeped through the thin walls, a reminder that the night on Varela 9 was not gentle. Jace sat with his back straight, watching Kyle and Mina as they finished the last bites of their sandwich. His own small piece still lay untouched on the table in front of him, Kyle noticed first. He glanced at the bread, then at his father. Jace kept his face calm, but Kyle had lived long enough to know when his father was hiding something. Mina, too, realized it. She looked at the sandwich, then tore her own piece in half and slid one portion across the table toward him. "You should eat this," she said, her voice soft but firm. Jace shook his head and pushed it back toward her. "No, you need it more." "But you worked all day," Mina argued. Her small hands pushed the bread back again, and this time there was a stubborn crease in her brow. Kyle watched the exchange silently, his eyes flicking between them. Jace leaned forward and gently moved the bread back toward her. "I'm fine. I'll eat later." There was no point explaining that there was nothing else for him to eat later. He knew they would worry, and he could not let that happen. His children needed hope, not more fear. Mina hesitated, then took the bread back reluctantly. She bit into it slowly, as if unsure whether she was making the right choice. Kale ate the last of his portion, then leaned back with a small sigh. He was still hungry, Jace could see it in his eyes, but the food had eased the sharpest edge of it. The light in the room flickered once, and Jace glanced at the ceiling. The colony's power grid was old and patched together from parts scavenged over the years. In bad weather, the lights sometimes went out without warning. He hoped tonight would not be one of those nights. Kale broke the quiet. "Did you find anything good at the yard today?" Jace thought for a moment before answering. "A few usable wires, some old bolts, nothing the traders were willing to pay much for." "Maybe tomorrow," Kyle said, though his tone carried little conviction. Jace nodded but said nothing. He wanted to tell them that things would get better, but he had learned that empty promises did more harm than good. Instead, he focused on what he could control, keeping them safe, warm, and fed, even if it meant going without himself. He reached into his work bag and pulled out 2 small pieces of scrap metal, handing one to each child. They were oddly shaped, smooth on one side and ridged on the other. Mina turned hers over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. Kale smiled faintly. "These were part of a control panel on an old freighter," Jace explained. "See, the lines here? That's where the circuits connected." Mina ran her finger over the grooves. "It's pretty." Kale set his piece down on the table. "Maybe we can keep them. Like lucky coins," Jace agreed. Small things mattered here, little reminders that there was still something worth holding on to. The children placed the scraps carefully in a small tin box they kept under the couch. It was their treasure box, filled with bits and pieces Jace had brought home over the years. None of it had real value to traders, but to Kale and Mina, it was a growing collection of stories. The wind outside picked up, rattling the walls. A distant boom echoed across the hills, maybe from a shift in the frozen ground or a salvage drone, shutting down. The noise made Mina flinch, but Jace put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's just the weather," he said. "Nothing to worry about." They stayed together in the warm glow of the heater for a while longer. Eventually, Mina's eyes grew heavy. She curled up against her father's side, her breathing slowing. Kale sat nearby, staring at the heater's faint orange light. Jace could see the thoughts in his son's eyes, questions about how long they could last like this, about when help might come. He wished he had answers. When Mina had fallen asleep, Jace gently lifted her into the small sleeping nook in the corner. The blanket was thin, but he tucked it tightly around her to keep out the cold. Cale followed, settling into his own narrow bed without a word. Jace returned to the table and stared at the small piece of bread he had left untouched earlier. The hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it. He picked up the bread, tore it in half, and placed each half in a small wrapping. He would save it for tomorrow. Even if it was only a mouthful, it might make the difference between strength and weakness. When he went back to the yard, he sat for a long time in the quiet. The heater's hum became a steady lullaby, but his mind would not rest. He thought about the pirates blocking the trade routes, about the cargo ships stranded just beyond the colony's reach. He thought about the long treks he had made across the scrapyard, searching for anything that might be worth enough to trade. And most of all, he thought about his children, how they had grown up faster than they should have, how they had learned to hide their hunger and pretend they were fine so he would not worry. His gaze drifted to the tin box under the couch. The scraps inside were worthless to the outside world, but each one was proof that they had endured another day. Each piece was a small victory. Finally, he stood and switched off the light, leaving the heater to cast its faint glow over the room. The wind outside was still strong, but inside the shelter it was calm. Jace lay down on the small cot near the door, keeping one ear open for trouble. He had done what he could for tonight. Tomorrow would be another battle, but for now, his children were warm and their stomachs were not empty, and that was enough. The morning came slowly to Varela 9. Pale light from the rising sun slipped through the small window of Jace's shelter, painting the walls in soft gold. The wind outside had calmed during the night, but the air was still cold enough to bite at exposed skin. Jace sat at the table, carefully unwrapping the small piece of bread he had saved from the night before. His children were still asleep, curled under their blankets in the corner. He let the bread rest on the table and rubbed his tired eyes. His body ached from the days of hard work at the salvage yard. His mind ached from the constant worry that they were running out of time. Supplies in the colony were nearly gone. The stores were empty. Neighbors whispered about hunger, about sickness, about the fear that no help would come before the blockade crushed them completely. A soft sound caught his attention. Mina stirred first, blinking sleep from her eyes. Kyle sat up soon after, rubbing his arms for warmth. Jace gave them both a smile and slid the bread toward them. Mina's eyes lit up, and she split it into 2 small portions without hesitation. She handed one to Cale, who accepted it quietly. They ate slowly, as if trying to make the taste last. Jace sat with them, pretending he was not hungry. He asked them about their dreams, about the stories they used to make up when times were better. Mina spoke of a giant bird that could carry them over the hills to a city of light. Cale said he dreamed of flying a ship so fast that pirates could never catch it. Jace listened with a smile, but inside he felt the weight of their words. They were dreams born from the need to escape. When the bread was gone, Cale wiped his hands and looked at his father. His eyes were serious, more serious than a boy his age should have. "You're my hero," Cale said quietly. The words hit Jace like a force he had not expected. He froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. He saw Mina glance between them, her expression soft but curious. "Why do you say that?" Jace asked gently. "Because you always give us your food. Because you work even when you're tired. Because you keep us safe," Cale replied without hesitation. Jace felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell his son that he was not a hero, that he was just doing what any father would do. But looking at Cale's face, he understood that these words meant more than praise. They were a reminder that his children still believed in him. Even when he doubted himself, he reached out and placed a hand on Cale's shoulder. "I'll always take care of you," That's my job. Kyle nodded and gave a small smile, but Jace could see the question hiding in his eyes, the question of how long this could last. Jace knew the answer could not be measured in weeks. If they waited for the blockade to end on its own, the colony might not survive. If he wanted his children to have a real chance, he needed to do something now. The decision began forming in his mind as the morning went on. After breakfast, he stepped outside to check the sky. Thin clouds drifted past the twin suns. The air was sharp, but the weather was clear enough for travel. Beyond the colony walls lay miles of frozen plains leading to the old relay station. It was abandoned years ago, but Jace had heard rumors that some parts still worked. If he could repair the long-range comms, maybe he could call for help from the Terran fleet. The journey would be dangerous. The plains were home to wild storms and half-buried salvage drones that sometimes malfunctioned. But Jace had faced worse in the salvage yards. What scared him most was the thought of leaving Kale and Mina behind, even for a day. He went back inside and began packing what little he could carry: a coil of wire, a handful of tools, a scrap of insulated cloth to keep his hands warm. The tin box of treasures stayed under the couch. He wanted his children to keep it close while he was gone. Mina watched him with wide eyes. "Where are you going?" Jace hesitated, then knelt down so they were eye level. "There's a place out there that might help us call for food ships. I'm going to try and fix it." Kale frowned. "It's far, isn't it?" "It is," Jace admitted. "But I'll come back. I promise." He did not add that promises meant little if the weather turned against him. Instead, he gave them each a small task. Mina was to keep the heater running and use the smallest amount of fuel possible. Kyle was to watch over her and keep the door locked at all times. He repeated these instructions until they could both recite them back to him. Before leaving, he took out a small metal disc from his work bag, a smooth piece of salvage he had kept for years. He pressed it into Kale's hand. "This is for you. Keep it safe. If you ever feel scared, hold it tight. And remember, I'm coming back." Kale closed his fingers around it. "I will." Mina hugged him tightly, and Jace held her longer than usual. Then he stood, pulled his coat around his shoulders, and stepped outside. The wind greeted him immediately, cold and sharp. The colony's walls rose behind him, their edges lined with ice. Ahead lay the white expanse of the plains, stretching farther than the eye could see. He took one last look at the shelter. Kyle and Mina were watching from the small window. He lifted a hand, and they waved back. The image stayed in his mind as he started walking, each step taking him farther into the silent, frozen world beyond the safety of home. The journey had begun. The plains beyond the colony stretched out like an endless sheet of pale silver. Thin layers of frost covered the ground, glistening faintly under the light of the twin suns. Jace's boots crunched with every step, leaving behind a narrow trail. That would be gone by nightfall. The air was dry and sharp, and each breath felt like it carried tiny shards of ice into his lungs. He kept his coat pulled tight around him, the scarf wrapped high over his mouth. The old relay station lay far to the north, hidden somewhere among the frozen hills. Jace had never been there himself, but other salvagers had spoken of it in passing. They said the main structure still stood, though its power systems had long since gone silent. If the comm array inside could be repaired, it might still reach ships beyond the blockade. That was the hope driving him forward. Behind him, the colony. Walls were already small on the horizon. He tried not to think about Kale and Mina watching him leave. Every step he took was a promise to return, but he knew the plains could be unforgiving. The weather could change quickly here. What began as a clear day could turn into a storm in minutes. The first hours passed in steady silence. Jace kept a slow but constant pace, stopping only to adjust his pack or drink from the small canteen of melted snow he carried. The land was flat at first, then began to slope upward toward low ridges. Half buried in the ice, he spotted the dark shapes of old machines, drones left to rust when the mining projects in this sector failed. Some were little more than twisted metal frames. Others still had their shells intact, their sensor eyes. Lifeless but watching, he passed one that looked almost intact. Its dull gray plating was streaked with frost, and one of its arms was broken at the joint. For a moment he thought about salvaging a part or two, but the weight in his pack was already enough. Besides, the station was his only goal now. Extra. Scrap would mean nothing if he could not reach it in time. As the suns rose higher, the air warmed slightly, and the frost began to melt into thin streams that trickled through cracks in the ground. Jace followed one of these streams for a while, knowing it might lead him toward a safer path through the hills. His boots slipped now and then on the wet stone beneath the ice, but he kept his balance and pressed on. By midday, clouds began to gather in the distance. They moved low and fast, their edges ragged and dark. Jace felt the change in the air almost immediately. The wind picked up, sharp and restless, carrying with it the faint hiss of ice crystals tumbling across the plains. He adjusted his scarf and quickened his pace, knowing that once the storm arrived, visibility could drop to nothing. He reached the base of a long ridge and started the climb. The slope was gradual but covered in loose stones that shifted under his boots. At the top, the view opened to a valley scattered with more abandoned machines. Some were toppled on their sides. Others were upright but frozen in place, their frames locked by years of cold. In the far distance, just beyond the valley, he saw a faint outline against the sky. A jagged shape that could only be the relay station relief stirred in his chest, but he pushed it down. The station was still far, and the storm was moving faster than he had hoped. He descended into the valley, weaving between the hulks of old drones and transport carts. Each one stood like a silent monument to the colony's past failures. The ground here was uneven, forcing him to slow his pace. Near the center of the valley, he heard it, a faint whirring sound. He stopped and listened. At first he thought it was the wind. Then it grew louder, steady and mechanical. One of the drones, half hidden behind a mound of ice, shifted slightly. Its head swiveled, and a single red sensor light flickered to life. Jace froze. Old salvage drones were unpredictable when reactivated. Some were harmless, their programming too damaged to function. Others could still follow their original patrol routines, scanning for intruders and treating them as threats. He slowly stepped back, keeping his movements calm. The drone's head tracked him, but it did not advance. After a tense moment, its light flickered out again, and the valley was silent once more. He let out a slow breath and moved on, careful not to disturb any more machines. By the time he reached the far edge of the valley, the clouds overhead had thickened, and the first flakes of snow were drifting down. The wind howled across the ridge, carrying the smell of frozen dust. The climb toward the relay station was harder than he expected. The ground rose steeply here, the rocks slick with ice. His hands ached from gripping cold stone, and his legs burned from the effort. Still, he pushed upward, glancing often toward the dark shape ahead. The closer he came, the more he could see of the building. Its walls cracked but standing, its tall comm tower leaning slightly to one side. The antenna at the top was bent, but it was still there. That meant there was a chance it could be fixed. Snow began to fall harder now, carried in fast waves by the wind. Jace pulled his hood tighter and lowered his head against the blast. The last stretch felt endless, but finally, his boots crunched against the frozen steps that led up to the station's main entrance. The metal doors were closed, their surface covered in frost. He placed a gloved hand against them and felt the bitter cold seeping through. With effort, he forced the doors open just enough to slip inside. The air inside was stale and heavy, but it was warmer than the outside. Dim light filtered through. cracks in the roof casting pale beams across the dust-covered floor. Old consoles lined the walls, their screens dark. Cables hung from the ceiling like vines, some snapped, others trailing to the floor. Jace dropped his pack and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. His journey across the plains had taken most of the day, and the storm outside was already growing stronger. He had reached the station, but his work was only beginning. Somewhere in this building, the comm array was waiting, and if he could bring it back to life, it might mean the difference between survival and collapse for the colony. He pulled out his tools, checked the power cells he had brought, and stood. The storm could rage outside all night if it wanted. He was here now, and he was not leaving without trying. The inside of the relay station was silent except for the faint whistle of wind slipping through cracks in the roof. Jace's breath came out in pale clouds as he studied the main control room. Dust lay thick on every surface. Panels were cracked, and most of the wiring hung loose like tangled roots. The comm tower outside might still stand, but if the control systems here were dead, it would do no good. He moved from one console to another, brushing away dust and wiping frost from the screens. None of them lit up. The station's main power supply had likely been offline for years. He crouched near a wall panel and pried it open with the edge of his multi-tool. Inside, the wiring was brittle, and the main relay core had a crack running through it. He would have to bypass it entirely if he wanted to get any power flowing from his pack. He pulled out the spare wires, 2 small power cells, and a soldering tool he had scavenged months ago. Working in the salvage yard had taught him how to repair almost anything with the right patience. This time he needed more than patience. He needed luck. Outside, the storm grew louder, snow striking the walls in sharp bursts. The wind howled through the antenna tower above, making the whole structure groan. Jace worked quickly, stripping old wires and replacing them with new lines from his pack. Every few minutes, he stopped to check the readings on his handheld meter. Slowly, a trickle of power began to move through the system. A small light near the far console blinked once, then went dark again. Jace frowned. Something in the tower's link to the control room was broken. He followed the thick cable running from the main console to a side hatch that led out onto a narrow, maintenance walkway. The hatch was stiff, but he managed to push it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a blast of snow. The walkway shook under his boots as he stepped outside. The comm tower loomed above him, its metal surface coated in ice. Climbing the tower in this weather was dangerous, but without repairing the uplink, all his work inside would mean nothing. He secured the cable to his belt and started the climb. The wind clawed at him from all sides, and icy rungs bit into his gloves. Halfway up, he spotted the problem. One of the main connection plates had come loose and was hanging at an angle, its wires exposed, balancing against the gusts. Jace pulled the plate back into position. He reconnected the wires one by one, his fingers stiff from the cold. At last, he tightened the final bolt and gave the plate a hard push. It stayed in place. A low hum vibrated through the tower, faint but steady. Climbing back down, Jace re-entered the station and returned to the control room. This time, when he pressed the main console's power switch, several small lights flickered on. One screen buzzed faintly, showing a field of static. He allowed himself a small smile. It was progress. He began calibrating the comm array, using the few working controls to rotate the antenna. Each adjustment sent a slow pulse through the system, and the static on the screen shifted. He tuned it carefully, trying to lock on to the emergency Terran fleet channel. The connection was weak, but after several long minutes, he heard a faint crackle in the speakers. "This is relay station. 3-7. Signal unstable. Repeat. Signal unstable." A distorted voice came through. Jace leaned closer and pressed the transmit button. "This is Jace Torin from Varela 9. We are under blockade. Supplies nearly gone. Requesting immediate assistance." The speakers hissed, then fell silent. He repeated the message, speaking slowly and clearly. After a moment, the voice returned, still faint but stronger than before. Message received. Hold position. Fleet response in progress. Jace felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the reality that fleet response could mean hours or even days. The storm outside made long-distance communication unstable, and there was no way to know how much of his message had reached them. Still, the connection was made. That alone was a victory. He sent the message again, adding details about the blockade and the colony's urgent need for food and medicine. Each time he transmitted, the static seemed to clear a little more. Somewhere out there, someone had heard him. The storm raged on outside, hammering the walls and making the old building shake. Jace knew he could not leave until the weather passed. He set the system to repeat his transmission every 15 minutes and turned to the small storage room near the back of the station. Inside, he found a few sealed containers, emergency supplies from the station's old crew. Most were empty, but one still held a thin blanket and 2 small ration packs. He ate half of one, saving the rest for the journey back hours past. The repeated messages continued, and each time he checked the readings, the signal strength was holding steady. The thought of Kale and Mina waiting back at the shelter stayed with him, urging him to keep going, to make sure the connection would not fail. He tightened the bolts on the tower's base, checked every wire twice, and kept the system warm with one of his power cells. By nightfall, the storm began to weaken. The wind's howl softened to a low hum, and the snow outside slowed to a steady drift. Jace stepped out onto the walkway one more time, looking toward the dark horizon. The colony lay far beyond those hills, unseen but never forgotten. Somewhere out there, his children were waiting, and now there was hope that help was on the way, back inside. He sat by the console, watching the steady blink of the transmission light. The rhythm of it was almost calming. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to certainty. He had done what he set out to do. The fleet would come. It had to. As he leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settled into his bones. But this time, the weight was different. It was not the heaviness of hopelessness. It was the tiredness of a man who had given everything he could and seen it work. When he closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was the small window of his shelter and 2 faces pressed against the glass, waiting for him to return. Tomorrow he would start the journey back. The sun rose over Varela 9 with a pale light that barely warmed the frozen plains. Jace walked slowly back toward the colony. His steps were heavy, his legs sore from days of travel. Every muscle in his body ached, but there was a quiet hope in his heart. He had sent the signal. Now all he could do was wait and trust that someone had heard him. The colony was quiet when he returned. People moved about with tired faces, their eyes filled with the same worry they had carried for weeks. The food stores were almost empty. Many had started eating only once a day to make what little they had last longer. Jace carried a small bundle of scrap he had collected on the way back. It was not much, but it could be traded for a little soup or bread. Kyle and Mina ran to him as soon as they saw him. Mina threw her arms around his waist, and Kyle grinned up at him. They both looked thinner than before, but their smiles gave him strength. He knelt down and hugged them tightly, holding them for a moment longer than usual. "Did you fix it, Papa?" Kale asked. "I fixed it," Jace said, smiling. "I sent a message to the Terran fleet. If they hear it, they might come." The children's eyes widened. They had heard many stories of the Terran fleet, the great ships that traveled between worlds keeping peace and helping colonies. For a moment, they let themselves believe. Hours passed. Jace spent the day repairing a damaged heater for a neighbor in exchange for a few dried vegetables. He tried to stay busy, but his mind kept drifting to the frozen plains beyond the colony. Was help on the way, or had his signal been lost in the silence of space? That night, the wind howled outside their shelter. Jace tucked Kale and Mina into bed and sat by the small heater. His eyelids grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake a little longer. Somewhere deep inside, he felt something was about to happen. Just before dawn, the ground began to tremble. A low rumble filled the air, building into a deep thunder. That shook the walls. Jace jumped to his feet. He rushed outside, his breath freezing in the cold morning air. The sky was no longer empty. Massive shapes cut through the thin clouds. The Terran fleet had arrived. Their ships glowed faintly in the weak sunlight, sleek and silver against the pale blue sky. People poured out of their shelters, pointing and shouting. Hope spread like fire across the colony. Jace stood still, his heart pounding. He watched as smaller craft detached from the great ships, descending toward the landing fields. Within minutes, the first aid ships touched down. The colony workers and Terran fleet officers moved quickly, unloading crates of supplies. Food, medicine, blankets, and fuel were carried into the settlement. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. For many, it was the first time in weeks they had smelled something warm and comforting. Kale and Mina ran to Jace, their faces bright with excitement. "They came, Papa," Mina said, her voice trembling with joy. "They really came." "Yes," Jace said softly. "They heard us." Fleet officers greeted the colonists with warm smiles. One of them, a tall woman in a dark blue uniform, approached Jace. She had sharp eyes but a kind expression. "You are the one who sent the signal," she said. "We received it 2 days ago. You saved this colony." Jace shook his head. "I just did what I had to do." The officer nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes that's what makes a person a hero." That day, the colony changed. The blockade was gone. The pirates had fled when the fleet arrived. The food shortages ended as large containers of supplies were distributed. People worked together to unload shipments and repair broken systems. Laughter and chatter replaced the silence of hunger. Jace carried a basket of fresh bread back to his shelter. The smell was so rich and warm that it made his eyes sting. Kyle and Mina were waiting for him at the door. He handed them each a piece, and they bit into it with wide smiles. It was not just food that had returned. It was life, hope, and a sense of safety. That evening, as the sun dipped below the icy horizon, Jace watched the fleet ships preparing to leave. He knew they would not stay forever. The colony would need to stand on its own again. But for now, they had been given a second chance. When night fell, Jace sat by the heater with his children beside him. Kale leaned against his arm, still holding the last bite of bread as if he wanted to make it last forever. Mina yawned and curled up close. Outside, the fleet's lights shone in the distance like stars that had come down to rest on the plains. Inside, Jace felt a deep calm. They had survived the worst, and this time, they were not alone. The days after the Terran fleet's arrival passed in a blur of new energy and hope. The colony of Varela 9, once heavy with worry and hunger, now buzzed with the sounds of life. Children laughed as they ran through the streets, and the smell of fresh food filled every shelter. Jace watched it all with a quiet smile, though deep inside, he still felt the weight of everything they had been through. Kale and Mina were healthier already. Their cheeks were rounder, and the sparkle had returned to their eyes. Jace found joy in the small moments. Mina showing him a drawing she made, Kale carefully organizing his collection of small treasures. These simple things reminded him why he had risked so much to bring help. One evening, as the twin moons rose high, Jace sat with his children near the heater in their shelter. Mina rested her head against his shoulder, and Kale sat close, his hand wrapped around the small metal disc Jace had given him before his journey. The room was warm, and outside the wind whispered softly through the colony. Kyle looked up at Jace with a serious expression. "Papa, you're really a hero, aren't you?" he asked quietly. Jace smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm no hero, Kyle. I just did what any father would do to protect his family. But you saved everyone, Mina added, her eyes wide. Not just us. Jace shook his head gently. The real heroes are the people who never gave up, the people who kept working and hoping, even when things were hard. Cale thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. But you were the one who went out into the cold all alone. You faced the storms and the machines. That took courage. Jace reached out and ruffled Kyle's hair. It took love more than courage. Mina smiled and hugged her father's arm. Love is stronger than anything. Jace looked around their small shelter. It was simple and worn, but it was home, a place where he and his children had survived the worst and found hope again. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. The fleet's crew helped repair the colony's broken machines and clear the frozen paths. Food shipments arrived regularly, and the fear of hunger faded with each passing day. Jace found work fixing machines again, but now it was different. The work was lighter, and the people were grateful. He no longer felt the crushing weight of despair. Instead, he felt proud. Proud of his children, proud of the colony, and proud of himself. One afternoon, as Jace helped unload crates of supplies, Cale came running up to him with a wide grin. "Papa, look," he said, holding out a small model ship he had built from scraps. Jace took the ship and examined it carefully. "It's very good, Cale. You have a talent for building." Cale beamed. "I want to be like the fleet pilots. I want to fly fast ships and protect people." Jace nodded. "And you will. I believe in you." That night, as the colony settled under the stars, Jace sat outside for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. The great ships of the Terran fleet were still docked nearby, their lights shining like guardians over the settlement. He thought about how close they had come to losing everything, about the nights when hunger felt like a shadow pressing down on them all, about the strength it had taken to keep going. But more than anything, he thought about Kyle and Mina, about their trust in him, about the whispered words that had changed everything. "You're my hero," Cale had said. Those words had carried Jace through the coldest nights and the loneliest hours. They had reminded him that being a hero was not about grand deeds or great power. It was about love, about showing up no matter how hard it was, about never giving up on the people you care about. As the wind whispered through the colony, Jace smiled softly. The true reward was here, in the warmth of this moment, in the faces of his children, and in the hope they shared for a better future. He stood and walked back inside, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that with love and courage, they could overcome anything.